From fighting for desegregated lunch counters to Black-owned fast food franchises, the story of racial capitalism in America is often told through the lens of policy and protest. At the heart of the civil rights movement sat the fight for desegregated public spaces, demanding not just a seat, but recognition, dignity, equality. So what happens when the language of liberation is co-opted by corporations and repackaged for the marketplace? You are tuning in to the Art of Citizenry Podcast. I'm your host, Manpreet Kalra. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, I want to welcome you. For those who have listened before, it is an honor to have you here with me again. Art of Citizenry is a community-supported podcast dedicated to reframing the issues of our time and collective liberation. Being listener-supported allows me to have unfiltered and nuanced conversations to really identify ways we can build a more equitable future, one that's restorative and just. To support this podcast, please give it 5 stars on your favorite listening app, and be sure to subscribe. Also, I really hope you consider contributing by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. During this episode, we are exploring how corporations capitalize on moments of social unrest to rebrand themselves as agents of change without addressing the very systems that fuel injustice. McDonald's has been making headlines lately, from economic boycotts sparked by its rolling back of DEI initiatives and price gouging to growing scrutiny of its complicity in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Looking back at the history of McDonald's reveals just how deeply the company is embedded in the architecture of racial capitalism and how it has leveraged moments of social uprising to expand its reach, often at the expense of the very communities it claims to serve. To help us frame today's conversation, it is important to first take a moment to understand the historical context that underpins the concept of Black capitalism, which emerged as both a response to and a strategy within the systemic exclusion of Black Americans from the U.S. economy. Black capitalism reemerged in the late 1960s as a strategic response to growing social unrest in Black communities, a way to promise progress without confronting the structural roots of racial inequality. Rather than challenging segregation, discriminatory lending, or systemic disinvestment, it framed community empowerment through entrepreneurship and market participation. Black capitalism was frequently used as a political tool to promote bootstrap narratives while sidestepping demands for reparative justice and state accountability. The model promised empowerment, but actually just sought market participation without confronting the racist economic systems that created the need for it in the first place. From the civil rights movement to now, we're watching the same playbook unfold. Justice movements absorbed, monetized, and recast as market opportunities. I am joined by Dr. Marcia Chatelain, historian and author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Franchise: The Golden Arches in Black America, to unpack how McDonald's became deeply embedded in the economic and political life of Black communities. We explore the American blueprint for corporate co-option of justice movements, and perhaps most importantly, we discuss how tying historically disenfranchised communities to entrepreneurship and commerce under the guise of empowerment can obscure the path to true liberation. From the collision of civil rights and capitalism to the unique precedent set by this corporate power, let us together ask deeper questions about how justice gets repackaged, who profits, and what liberation could look like.
Thank Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. My name is Marcia Chatelain, and I am a professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm trained as a historian, and my research is really looking at African American life and culture through various lenses. My first book was about African American girlhood in Chicago during the Great Migration period. My second book was about the relationship between Black communities and McDonald's as a way of understanding racial capitalism and Black capitalism after 1968. And I'm trying to crawl through some edits of a new book about Black women in the 1963 March on Washington. So I like to really start with kind of big ideas, big moments that everyone can kind of think about in terms of its like most basic terms, right? So everyone has an idea about what childhood should or shouldn't be. And most people are aware of some of the social changes that happen after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Most people can identify some aspects of the 1963 March on Washington. And then after I get everyone at the table, I say, well, how about if we look at it from a different perspective, from a different place? So a lot of my teaching and writing is about recapturing these moments that have become kind of lost or reduced or diluted in historical memory.
I had a chance to spend time with your work, and what struck me most and what I deeply appreciate is the way you so thoughtfully contextualize history. Your scholarship doesn't just engage with fast food as a business story. It reveals how food culture, corporate power, and Black American communities have long been entangled, effectively illustrating the story of racial capitalism through McDonald's. You end the new preface of your book with a sentence that really stood out to me. McDonald's had helped determine, for better or for worse, where we live, what we eat, and how we fight for justice. You know, earlier this summer, we saw a week-long boycott of McDonald's sparked by their rollback of DEI initiatives and price gouging. So to start us off, what do we need to understand about how this corporation became so embedded, not just in the everyday life, but the economic and political struggle of Black America?
I write about a very specific period in McDonald's history, but it really is an evergreen topic because of the strategies. And I would say some deeply disingenuous strategies. And I think that there were some people who were very thoughtful actors around how McDonald's was going to appear in Black America. And so if we think about the origins of McDonald's and 1950s fast food culture, a lot of it is predicated on policies around racial segregation and gatekeeping. So whether it's the fact that a lot of these restaurants were to fit into the retail spaces of suburban America, which we know was highly racially discriminatory in its lending practices and its housing policies. And if you think about the bank loans that went to young white entrepreneurs to franchise fast food restaurants like McDonald's, you know, McDonald's and racial capitalism are deeply entwined. What happens after 1968, after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, is McDonald's sees a growth opportunity in capturing the Black market, urban market in terms of their stores, and then they see how successful it is. And then they become, you know, what corporations will see as the leader on DEI. You know, the retrenchment for DEI is just so consistent when we look at corporate history, right? People will do the things that are advantageous and then they will pull out when it's advantageous again. But every company that has made this decision hasn't been responded to in the same way. And I think the reason why McDonald's was so important is because they built their brand on a special kind of relationship with Black consumers and then other consumers of color at the critical moments where they could have lost the brand. So they grow in the 70s because of the Black consumer dollar. And they're able to really capitalize on their advertising dollars because they start to put forward Black celebrities who are considered crossover hits like, you know, Michael Jordan. So in 2024, after the election, when they say we're not going to do our DEI goals in such explicit ways, they weren't just anticipating what the Trump administration was doing. They were acting, I think, at the tail end of a level of divestment that had been happening for decades. And so it wasn't as abrupt or it wasn't as shocking as maybe some other companies. But the reason why it's important is because marketing to African American communities has made them lots and lots of money. And I think that that is something that, cannot be forgotten. They would like to tell it as a story of benevolence and a story of social progress. But what it ultimately is a story of racialized market segmentation that was very successful and made people lots and lots of money.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really critical piece of the narrative that often gets lost. McDonald's is frequently cited in textbooks, marketing classes, as one of the first companies to strategically identify and target untapped segments of the market, particularly the Black community, which has been historically left out of the marketing strategies of most corporations. But what often gets overlooked is how a business decision, one rooted in profit and expansion, can later be reframed as a DEI initiative. And we have to be clear, those two things are not the same. The intent behind them and the outcomes they produce can be fundamentally different. The decision to market to Black consumers wasn't one, at least from what I understand, that came from a place of corporate benevolence. It came from a conscious decision to expand market capture in order to increase profits, making it ultimately a household name.
Well, one of the things I found really curious when I was writing my book is when I was looking at the history of protests against segregated public accommodations, particularly restaurants in the South, how frequently McDonald's appears as a target of groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But McDonald's has been essentially written out of that history. When we think about places where people were doing sit-ins around lunch counters, around access to, accommodations, we think of brands that are no longer here. We think of Woolworths counters, but you could say that the McDonald's drive-in was another site of that kind of political action. But I think because they were so hasty in embracing the Black capitalism solution to post-1968 urban unrest and calls for racial and economic justice, they kind of wrote themselves into a civil rights narrative almost immediately. And so they were completely divorced from that history.
I'm curious what you think, but to me, it seems like they are effectively rewriting their brand legacy.
100%.
Yeah, so when we talk about health disparities in the US, we can't ignore the role fast food has played, not just in terms of its rise, but the deliberate targeting of specific communities. Your book, Franchise, powerfully recounts how McDonald's became deeply entrenched in Black neighborhoods. Can you walk us through that history? And expanding the conversation further, how did civil rights and capitalism collide in a way that allowed fast food to become part of the economic landscape of Black America? I'm thinking about how a corporate expansion strategy could so effectively be framed as a civil rights victory, and what that says about this larger conversation around McDonald's reframing their own corporate history.
The extent to which capitalism has been central to the goals of mainstream civil rights movements is something that I think is important for us to pay attention to, because it helps us understand and even anticipate some of the decisions that are made that sometimes feel a little contradictory or a little uncomfortable. And I think that's throughout the McDonald's story. So what happens in the 1960s is that a lot of the strategies about changing federal law to protect Black people in public accommodations and like restaurants and hotels, motels, bus stations, a lot of those confrontations are about the enactment of the 14th Amendment, right? Equal protection under the law. But they're done in places in which commerce is being transacted, right? Money is being spent or not being spent. So when we look at the Montgomery bus boycott, right, it's an economic action that's making a larger claim about Black rights and Black citizenship. And that's really important. Don't get me wrong. The fundamental problem with this is that when we put these economic relationships at the center of activism and protest, we lose sight of the question of how does poverty then also demand something about rights among people who maybe not have the economic buying power to not spend or to spend in a very specific way, right? And I think that when we look at the more sophisticated understandings of Martin Luther King Jr., the last speech he gives before he is assassinated is not just about kind of justice broadly. He's speaking about economic justice in terms of boycott, but also mass movement and solidarity of workers, and in this case, sanitation workers. So he's talking about a complex system of what happens when capitalism is unchecked and the ways that, Black boycott is important, but there is a larger question about solidarity that goes outside of these kind of market relationships. So all of this is to say, where does McDonald's fit in? So, in the late 1960s, there is a real call for accountability on the part of major institutions, not just the federal government, but colleges and universities and corporations. 5 years ago, during the George Floyd summer, it was very similar types of conversations. What are you going to do? Who are you going to be in this moment? And after King's assassination, the country had gone through about 5 summers of just rampant violence on the part of police in urban and suburban and rural areas. King has been assassinated. People are exhausted. And I think that there's a portion of the movement that says, I don't know if we're really ever going to get a federal government that's responsive to racialized poverty or injustice, but we do have a landscape of corporations that are now asking different questions, right? We have colleges that are willing to open up the door a little bit for scholarships. We've got boarding schools that are willing to pluck kids out of certain areas to bring them to their schools. We've got to do something with this. And as I was writing Franchise, I was very aware of how easy it would be for me to be purely critical of the strategy and not empathetic to what drives a person from imagining beloved community as the goal to maybe we can get some stores open. Maybe someone can franchise a McDonald's. Maybe we can create some minimum wage jobs, and thinking of that as a victory. So McDonald's positions itself in the many ways that the companies of 2020 position themselves. They want to be on the right side of history. I mean, it's so sad, but it's true.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen this pattern before. History has a way of repeating itself. And that framing is just so jarring because it exposes how easily the language of justice can be co-opted to serve market goals. We saw this clearly in the wake of George Floyd's murder, when corporations rushed to issue statements and launch diversity campaigns without any meaningful commitments to dismantle the very systems that uphold racial injustice, even within their own organizations.
Yeah, and in the same kind of disgusting and offensive way that George Floyd's death becomes the leverage from it, imagine the gravitas that is added to say, we're going to continue King's dream. We're going to open a Dunkin' Donuts in this neighborhood. And this is real stuff that's coming out in the press. So you have that, and then you have a federal government that is escalating war abroad. They don't want to do any social spending. They have no intention of actually enforcing civil rights law. So they encourage corporations, right, to respond to Black protests with underwriting Black-owned business. And so it's so nefarious and it's so disgusting, but you see how it happens. You see people who were on the front lines of this movement, they're tired of being clubbed by the police. They're tired of being jailed. They haven't made, a living wage in years. They want to get some rest, and it gets funneled into this corporatist dream of equality. And companies like McDonald's make a very modest investment in the strategy, and they have great returns, and they keep on doing it. It's kind of interesting because the whole premise that companies are not going to do DEI because the government says so, it's as if companies never defy the government or regulators or bank policies or never use their corporate power to actually resist legislation. It's like no one had ever done lobbying before or ever heard of it. Companies know how to evade taxes, Clean Food and Drug Act. They know how to evade labor laws, but DEI is something that they could not strategize themselves around. And so, from my perspective, it's like the call is coming from inside the house. I think for many people who would consider themselves anti-Trump or liberal, this is the world they want to see, a world in which initiatives that have modestly, barely created more equity completely and totally shut down.
Yeah, so my work has focused a lot on corporate accountability, which is, to be frank, complicated. We often want to believe that corporations act out of a sense of moral responsibility, but more often than not, their decisions are driven by what maximizes profit, not what's ethically right. So, to your point, reflecting on the parallels to 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, suddenly companies were scrambling to issue statements and launch half baked initiatives. I remember VC firms in Silicon Valley announcing funds for Black founders. And these funds are so minuscule when looking at the overall portfolio of these firms. But even taking that out of the equation, the idea that we can just throw some money onto it and appear like we are correcting harm is both dangerous and disgusting.
Absolutely.
At the same time, I realize the sentiment that something is better than nothing, but at what cost? Who is actually benefiting? Because I would argue that the company is still the one ultimately benefiting. They're the ones that get the pat on the back, the recognition, the news articles, the invitations to speak about DEI, etc. This disillusionment is real. There's this widespread idea, particularly in the corporate social responsibility space, that when the government fails, corporations can step in and fill the void. But I struggle with that belief because corporations aren't designed to serve public good. They're designed to serve profit. We need functioning systems of governance, not corporate stand-ins for justice. And in the context of this conversation, I keep coming back to the way fast food franchising was framed, as you've pointed out, as a form of Black capitalism. I'm curious how that vision both aligned with and in many ways conflicted with broader movements for economic justice and self-determination.
Well, I think what happens in the case of franchising is it's presented to a lot of people as business ownership, which it is not. It's in the same way that I own my house, but the bank is, involved in that relationship as well, right? I don't own it, and so I think this idea that if you own a business, then you have a kind of power in your community is not a faulty idea if we look at the history of Black business, which used to have to step into that breach when people were denied access to loans, access to, public education, access to voting power. Black business owners used to be the people who would negotiate with white power structure or have enough capital to subvert it, right? So when you tell someone in 1968 who had grown up in Jim Crow, who was maybe born in 1938, that a Black-owned business owner would be in your neighborhood, they are imagining an era where that person, who's like the person who owns a funeral home or the person who owns the Black-owned bank, as possessing a lot of power. But what they're getting in that moment is a person who is beholden to government programs and to a corporation, and who will not have the kind of economic or political power of the Jim Crow era, because ostensibly you're supposed to have the real power that the Constitution affords you, right? So it's confusing. And there was a world where McDonald's wasn't the global leader that it is today. It was a large company that was getting bigger. In 1968, it's only been a franchise for about 13 years. It isn't in every state. It isn't around the world yet. It has a lot of potential. It's the first publicly traded fast food company. So people are really intrigued about this opportunity coming to your community. And then you have other African-American groups of various political stripes, from very conservative to very radical, who are also saying we have to have our own businesses or we have to have our own means of production. So a number of people try to create these manufacturing companies at the worst possible time for manufacturing. There are experiments like Seoul City, North Carolina, where people are thinking, can we build an industrial all-Black town with some federal funding and some private sector funding and people's commitments to do that? And it's a big ask, but, these are the same people who have been asked to put their bodies on the front line against the police in mass protests. So it's such a confusing space to be in that when you see people who have worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or the NAACP saying, yeah, I want to get into Black business franchising, or people who were deeply critical of capitalism saying, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should open a business and provide jobs and opportunities. So I see how we get here. But as a historian, I try to lay out the steps of how we get here so that if someone is in the position to discern what is next, they take a step back and say, maybe we don't choose this path. Maybe we imagine something else for ourselves.
Yeah. So what is next? I really appreciate you grounding this conversation in the present moment because we're seeing the same pattern repeat itself. Time and time again, corporations publicly align themselves with activist movements, using the language of justice and equity while privately continuing to invest in the very systems that harm those same communities. Given everything you've studied and the historical patterns you've uncovered, how should we be responding? What should we be paying attention to right now?
I always think that we should assess what our options are before we've determined that we've exhausted them. This year, I had over the past few years said, if I need something, I have to exhaust every option before I even imagine Amazon as an option. And now I just don't shop there, right? Now I just don't buy things on Amazon. So I just don't buy things. Unless it is, now sometimes we're painted in a corner where businesses only operate on Amazon. And so they kind of get you. But I think to myself, as a member of the working leisure class, right? Someone who can spend 10 minutes thinking about my consumer decisions, I say, do I need this thing? It's okay, I really do need this thing. Can I walk in my own neighborhood and buy it? This is the thing. I can get out of my house and I can just walk somewhere and buy it. And when I buy it, how do I preserve it for the long haul? This is not revolutionary action on my part, but if you get enough people doing that, right? And so we have to assess all our options. And the best way to do it is to actually talk to real people in real life. Spend time with people talking about what they're doing in real time. I think this is the other part of it that's so hard. We feel so isolated. Any person who's living in any conscientious manner at this particular moment in human history does not feel good. And every time I kind of feel myself falling into that, I talk to real people who are doing things and making choices that I want to hear about and I want to learn from. And so when people talk about being in community right now, I am not organizing any kind of mass action because no one I know wants to do a mass action. But living with integrity is also part of it. A lot of my students, after they read my book or read my work and say, so what does this mean for me? And I said, well, you have to decide what your path is going to be in the world. But I do want you to do this. Next time you go to an event for a political candidate and they say, we're going to deal with racial injustice by supporting more Black-owned businesses, or we're going to support entrepreneurship, ask them a question about what exactly does that mean and who does that help and how does that actually create a society where everyone is taken care of, right? These kind of platitudes about justice coming in the form of owning a business, it's so weird and it makes no sense. But a lot of the young people I know care a lot. And sometimes they say, I want to run for office, or I'm thinking about this. And I'll say, I have nothing to offer your political platform but this. Don't tell people that they're going to open businesses and it's going to lift the quality of life. Talk to people about the things that are fundamentally important to them. Start there, because no one did that back then, right? They did a lot of things, but no one really listened to the people who were saying these Black-owned business initiatives don't help us. And the types of businesses we want are grocery stores and bookstores. We want to be able to manufacture things on small scales. And then when they did appear with these ideas, everyone said, well, you can't do that. You can have a Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so I think that there are incredible people in the world who are fighting this historical moment on all fronts. And I think we can't lose sight of the value of reading books about history and talking about what we think is actually possible. And this is something that happens not only when corporations co-opt the conversation on justice, everything is done on their terms within their parameters. So we have access to this lending. We have access to this capital. We have access, but you don't have access to all the ideas. People have ideas. No matter how much you want to train AI to come up with, their ideas suck and they use too much water and they're racist. No matter what you want a computer to do, people can do things. And so I think the thing about it that really breaks my heart is that because of this ideological takeover that is not about a left-right divide, it's a fundamental problem of living under capitalism where every idea begins and ends with the market, is that this becomes the standard for contribution or for success, you know?
Absolutely. Entrepreneurship is so often sold as a golden ticket to economic success, especially when it comes to marginalized communities without any real engagement with what people actually need or want. It becomes a one-size-fits-all solution. And as you said earlier, as a result, inequality becomes synonymous with economics without significant effort to address the systemic underpinnings. And I would argue that disconnect can turn what's framed as empowerment into yet another form of extraction.
A lot of what was happening in the kind of late 2000s, maybe even a little earlier in the first Obama administration era, is that the success of a sound political strategy that led to a Black president, there was this high emphasis on what does Black achievement look like and feel like and where does it exist? And then it was more Black millionaires. This was the thing that McDonald's says, we make Black millionaires. Who cares? Nobody cares. Who's going to be the first, who was or who is the first Black billionaire? None of this is important. To capture generational wealth as matters of property and money fundamentally undermines what actual wealth is in communities. And so I would have these wonderful students who were really thoughtful and conscientious people say, well, I want to leave generational wealth. And I said, the generational wealth is a story that you can tell. The lessons and the cautionary tales and the jokes. I said, spend more time archiving what your grandparents say to you than trying to convince your grandparents to send their Social Security check to some Ponzi scheme so they can invest it. Like, let's stop using that as the barometer, because if we do that, then you fundamentally say that a people and a community are not valuable. They have nothing to pass on. So until they have money to pass on, right? Like, the thing that I hope my son appreciates about me was the kind of parent I was, and maybe the kind of scholar I was, hopefully, if he reads my books, if he likes them, you know, but I would hate for everything that I've thought about and done in the world to be reduced to, my mom left me a house. Who cares?
Absolutely. What you said makes me think about international development projects where the focus is often anchored around economic growth. And economic growth, more often than not, is equated with promoting entrepreneurship. The logic is more entrepreneurs will lead to more wealth, and more wealth equals success. But I've said this before, we don't necessarily need more entrepreneurs. What we need is more people and projects grounded in community, driven by community. Too often, international development goes in with a preset agenda of what a community needs, instead of asking, what do you actually want? There are clear parallels here. Economics has become the default language for solving everything. And while I fully recognize that economic stability is important for thriving communities, we have to be careful not to conflate stability and commerce alone. That's really the gray space we often overlook. We need to think about how we can create more comprehensive systems outside of traditional capitalist paradigms that nurture communities. And I think that's part of the appeal behind conversations around generational wealth, especially for people of color and first-generation immigrants like myself. We've seen white families build and pass down wealth, and we're told that if we just follow the same path, build businesses, generate income, we'll get there too. But the path isn't the same when the systems aren't built for you to begin with.
Well, I think that money frees you up in so many wonderful ways, right? I am very fortunate to have a job with flexibility because, I'm a high wage professional worker. I get that. And at the same time, other people could feel that freedom if we had just worker policies and if we had universal basic income and if everyone had a living wage and had time. So this idea that it can only come through one way, it can only come through entrepreneurship or you go to the right schools at the right time and you make lots of money. It's like, well, it could come in a lot of different ways. The fundamental question is, do we want to live in a society where people are so starved for their basic human needs that the only response we have to them is to work harder or to invent some type of app where you can like date someone or something, right? Like the possibilities are so ridiculous within this kind of closed structure that to engage in the conversation isn't to engage in a conversation about how smart or people are or how worthy they are. It's to really engage in a conversation of how broken we are, that we imagine that the human person is not enough of the criteria necessary to benefit a life that feels stable and secure and filled with choices.
Absolutely. The context you've shared sets us up beautifully to start thinking more expansively about what nourished communities actually look like and how we build them. We've been talking about McDonald's, but of course, it's just one part of a much larger conversation, one that intersects with race, public health, and food systems. We often hear the term food deserts used to describe limited access to fresh and nutritious food, but increasingly advocates are using the term food apartheid to better capture the systemic and racialized nature of that inequality. From your perspective, how does a term like food apartheid shift our understanding of how fast food chains like McDonald's have shaped food access for Black and Brown communities? And how might that help us better connect the dots between food culture and public health?
Right, because I think that the kind of issue that we are facing right now that most people are aware of is that, its most reduced idea is like people without privilege don't have access to a lot of different food options, right? Or we see a high concentration of fast food in certain communities and a kind of more moderate presence of fast food in another. Or we see fast food repackaged for different economic groups, right? Like fast casual is fast food for people with master's degrees, right? It's all kind of high scale manufacturing food. It's how it makes you feel and what it's supposed to suggest about healthiness or lack thereof. But I think that the larger question that is most important when we talk about public health, when we talk about communities, isn't just about, do people have access to food? And I think we have to be very careful about the use of the word healthy because that has just kind of been put through its own kind of spin cycle, like what's healthy, what's not healthy. But I like to think about it as, how do we ensure every community has a variety of options around food that is affordable, that makes sense for the lifestyles that people have and can kind of maximize the things that food are supposed to do, and that's to nourish you and to nourish communities. And I think one of the dangers sometimes when there is an analysis of food inequality that doesn't take into account of race and class and culture is that there's a misreading of how food is being used and its practicality. So I am a big believer that fast food is often the most practical decision for a lot of Americans because of the number of jobs that they work, because of a lack of access to refrigeration, because of a lack of time. So I will never tell someone not to eat fast food because fast food makes perfect sense. I want us to say, if we really are concerned about the impact of fast food on the American diet and lifestyle, what are we going to do to reform the systems that make fast food such a rational choice? How are we going to look into better subsidies on food to reduce the price? How are we going to create more economic incentives for creating grocery stores? How are we going to find alternative sources of energy that people can afford to refrigerate this food? How are we going to make sure that everyone can be home at a reasonable amount of time to cook the food or to spend time eating the food with their families instead of rushing from job to job? the task becomes more daunting, but then it allows more people to be part of the work, right? So that the question of food justice isn't just for the people who want to do the small urban farms or who want to, try to save SNAP essentially, because it's going to need saving at this point. But everyone's saying, yeah, I care about this issue. I'm an employer. Could we imagine having, there's some stores that do no business between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m. What if we closed earlier? Or what if we closed for a dinner break? What if everyone can, what if we can't do that, but everyone who works here between 5 and 6 can bring their kids here. We all eat together and then we can go home, or we can take turns on who has to stay late at night so that people can come and eat with their families, right? So some of this is revolutionary upending of capitalism, and some of it is just understanding the power that we may have to actually help people achieve the kind of food and nutrition goals that we imagine are ideal, right? But it requires us to understand that it isn't just about the individual choices that people make. And this is part of why I wrote Franchise, is that I was tired of hearing from people in the food justice movement, saying these really disparaging things about, mostly Black people, but communities of color and what they feed their kids and how they eat, and say, these are about a set of historical relationships that we're seeing the outcomes of, but the roots of it are so much deeper. And I think that when we think about, food as a source of joy and the possibility of food culture, of bringing communities together, it's really beautiful. But who has the time? I look at the way that the preparation of food is a form of entertainment, and it's kind of idealized, like, oh, look at this beautiful spread of food that this person created. Like, why is this so entertaining? It's because it's so rare.
And it's a luxury. Having time to prepare a nutritious meal from scratch, let alone sit with loved ones to eat it.
It's a luxury, And so I think that there are ways of fundamentally rethinking the cultural spaces in which we exist to get some of these outcomes that we sometimes think are only about, a farmer's market in your community or, a food pantry. And it's about allowing other people to have different relationships to food that are really restorative.
We're talking about redlining, environmental racism, targeted marketing, and the economic realities that force people to work multiple jobs just to get by. When you don't have time, energy, or access, fast food becomes the most viable option, not because it's a choice rooted in preference, but in survival. So how do we move away from narratives of blame and toward a more honest reckoning with the systems that shape our food environments?
The first thing is we have to acknowledge that, we're just the kind of unpaid shareholders of all these companies, right? Through tax dollars, through policy, we are all underwriting the cost of all these businesses, right? So how do we hold them accountable? How do we hold ourselves within communities accountable? And also, how do we think about talking to people in communities about their relationships to food that are actually really helpful, right? To helping them, understand that they may have more choices than they think, or introducing new choices. I think about this all the time. I grew up in a household with very little money. And I remember, when I would go to the house of my wealthier friends, they would have so much food in their house, just huge pantries. I'm from the Midwest, so people would have second refrigerators in the garage, or just these deep freezers, right? These independent freezers filled with frozen pizzas. And it was always just kind of shocking to me having access to so much food all the time. And I think that the question of how do we kind of right size our expectation for how much food each individual has at any given point, for no other reason than to just kind of imagine operating within our choices as an exercise for all people, not just people who don't have money. It's and I'm not one to idealize European food systems entirely, but I will say this. Going into a European household and seeing how tiny their refrigerator is, and being how do these people feed themselves, right? All of these things are about rebalancing our understanding of scale, I think is so important. And I think the public health community has a role to play in that. But I think to the extent that public health practitioners can be advocates in other worlds, that housing, urban development, other aspects of the kind of health delivery system, labor issues, they're all public health issues. And I think the more they engage them, I think the better kind of cross industry conversation can be had about, well, how do we help people have an expansive, wide diet that serves their best interests? Maybe we work with workplaces on actually talking about the importance of people getting to eat during a long day of work, right? More than 15 minutes. Or what are the incentives for people eating at work? That isn't about just because you're a high paid worker at Google, right? Like those types of things we associate with elite workplaces. But what if every workplace was subsidized to feed its workers? What different outcomes would we have, and what a different quality of life?
Absolutely. Public health can't exist in a silo. Housing, labor conditions, urban development, these are all deeply tied to health outcomes. And as you pointed out, reimagining the status quo of work culture is essential. It's not just about access to healthcare, it's about building systems that allow people to live with dignity. What would it mean if meal breaks, food access, and workplace nourishment weren't treated as perks for elite tech workers, but as a basic right for everyone? The ripple effects for health, well-being, and quality of life would be profound. That brings me to another thread in your work that really resonated for me, food culture, because food isn't just sustenance, it's memory, identity, and resistance. In my own Punjabi community, food is how we connect with our families, how we express care, how we pass down traditions. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on food culture as a tool of cultural preservation, especially in the face of systemic displacement, erasure, and structural harm. How has food served as not just nourishment, but as resistance and memory?
I think that this idea that food culture is a way to help kind of alleviate a lot of the stress and longing of nostalgia, right? Of people who are in migratory processes, whether it's, immigration or emigration or just displacement, right? Like people remember the things that they ate and how they ate it and where they ate it. And I think that this is one of the most kind of resonant things that I found when I was doing research that really struck with me. My book was supposed to be about something else and kind of evolved into the McDonald's book. But, there were people who were very critical to the civil rights movement. And when they write their memoirs or tell stories, they talk about eating at desegregated restaurants. And this was like the first kind of glimpse of like what else could be possible in the world. John Lewis had given a talk at Georgetown, maybe 2014 or 15. And he talked about eating Chinese food in Washington, D.C. before the March on Washington. And he had never had Chinese food before. And it was just such a powerful memory and an association with the time and place. And so I think that, the preservation of food cultures has been very important for African Americans because it's not just about kind of the production of food, it's the intellectual property, right? It's something that if you know a recipe and you commit it to memory, it is fundamentally yours. It is not a piece of property that can be repossessed or taken in retaliation. It's something you know how to do. And I think that when we look at oppressed and marginalized groups, memory and intellectual knowledge is something that people really value, not just for the sake of having it, but it's something that can't be lost the ways that other types of human attachments can be.
Absolutely. It comes down to the tangible versus intangible. A recipe passed down through generations, held in memory and made by hand, becomes something no system can take away. It's a reminder that in a world where so much can be stripped of you, land, wages, even freedom, there's still things that can be preserved, protected, and shared. That kind of knowledge is a quiet form of resistance and a powerful act of remembering, which brings me to this final question. What does food sovereignty actually look like in practice? In your work, you emphasize that to understand food in Black America, we have to look beyond the plate, at history, at systems of power, at identity and structural inequality. Can you share what it means to think about food beyond the plate and how that approach shifts our understanding of food, culture, and justice?
Yeah, I think that when we think about kind of food sovereignty, it's about the ability for people to nourish themselves with as little barrier and stress as possible, for foods that are indigenous to communities to remain there and to be available to them, right? And I think it ultimately means that when people are free, food is free. And when food is expensive, exclusionary, when access to food is, encumbered by barriers, that usually says something about how free or unfree a person is. And so when we think about, some of my colleagues who are doing excellent research on the diets that are available to people who are incarcerated, if we look at all of the research about nutrition and disparities that are indexed to socioeconomic class, we see that when people do not have the kind of social, political, and economic freedoms that everyone deserves, then their access to food, right, is also encumbered. The starvation that's happening in Gaza, the types of famine in South Sudan, right? People are in a state of unfreedom, and then food becomes this object that everyone needs, but people are risking their lives in order to be fed. This is heartbreaking. We think about food sovereignty. It isn't just about having choices or having options or being able to monetize the food you grow. It's about, you being free in your person to get the thing that you absolutely need. And that's so poignant to think about it in that way. But I think we have to start thinking about everything in that way if we're really going to create an idea of what human dignity is and what justice is. It's about, water, food, safety, housing, comfort. And these things, there should be no obstacle to accessing them.
Food is political. It's a mirror of power, policy, and history. If we want to build communities that thrive, not just survive, we need to move beyond market-based solutions and towards something more rooted, more collective, and more accountable.
We will go through another cycle of history. I don't know what it'll look like. But in the next cycle, please, everyone, remember what this moment felt like and tell people. And if we get on the other side of it and everything radically changes, remind people what this felt like. Because the forgetting is the first part of trying to harm and gaslight. It's the forgetting that always gets us.
Thank you to Dr. Marcia Chatelain for joining me in conversation and helping us unpack the complicated history of how racism and capitalism intertwine. Her insights help us contextualize the history of corporations' involvement in social movements and how we can learn from the past to ensure justice is not co-opted for profit. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrat.